So, good evening, everyone, and welcome. For those of you who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Ryan Hines, and I'm the Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the Dalla School of Public Health. I want to thank everyone for spending a little time with us tonight. We really appreciate it. We think you're going to enjoy it. Now, before we get started, I want to pause and I encourage everyone in our audience as well to pause, to remember, and to acknowledge that for many of us, the land that we're on is not our own. Whether our ancestors came here willingly or were brought here unwillingly, we came to a stolen land. Now I'm logging in today from Toronto, a place that I live and where our school operates. I want to acknowledge that for thousands of years before me, this land has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across our nation and across Turtle Island. I am, as we all are, blessed to live, work, and learn on this land. And I am forever grateful for the opportunity to do so. I know we all are. As it's important to acknowledge the land we're on, February sets time aside for us to acknowledge the history and to look to the future of Black communities. This year, the school has collaborated with some amazing partners to provide what I think are going to be some incredible events. Now, I may be biased, but I think they're really just great. These events have been pulled together all with the purpose of celebrating Black excellence through the arts. Now, info on these events can, of course, be found on the DLSPH events page, or they can be found on our newly launched Dalla School of Public Health Equity Hub, which I encourage you all to go check out. It's going to be a great experience, and we just launched it today. It's got everything that you need for it. And now that I check off, shamelessly promote the hub, okay? But just to give you a glimpse of what's to come, on February 24th, we've partnered with a well-known community bookstore and a cultural center called A Different Book List for a discussion with a Toronto-based author, poet, Knut Lawrence, on his recent book, which is a collection of poetry called Pathology of a Pandemic. On February 16th, we've partnered with Wilfrid Laurier University and the Factor Inuitash Faculty of Social Work to screen the short film, It Takes a Riot, Race, Rebellion, and Reform, followed by a discussion with the filmmakers and other panelists. On February 7th, we've partnered with the AGO to offer a virtual tour on art pieces and exhibits that center on Black communities, Black experiences, and Black artists. And we kick all that off with tonight's event. And for that, I'm going to ask Dean Staney Brown to come in and introduce it a little bit. Staney?
Thanks so much, Ryan. Hi, everyone. I'm Staney Brown. I'm the Dean of the Dalla School of Public Health. I want to thank everyone for attending this fireside chat tonight, and thanks, Ryan, for inviting me to say a few words to open it. This is a first for our school, and probably a much overdue first. But I'm really proud that we're doing this now, and Ryan, thanks for helping lead that. I think the real challenge now is what we're going to do to top this next year. But I'm proud that our school has grown so much recently in terms of diversity, and particularly in terms of Black health and Black excellence. Building on that, Professor Beverley Essue is one of our newest faculty members, is going to be here today, and she's going to be interviewing a giant in the field, Professor Dexter Voisin. But just a few words. Professor Essue is a global health economist. She studies how to implement health equity in low and middle income countries. She's leading training in our school right now in leadership for our most exciting PhD students. And she's come to us with a wealth of experience from around the world, both in leadership roles and in academic roles. But tonight we will hear Professor Essue interviewing Professor Dexter Voisin. He's currently Dean of Social Sciences at Case Western University, and he's the former Dean of Social Work here at U of T. I'm proud to say that as he left U of T, he maintained a position with us, and we're really grateful that he's joining us tonight. Professor Voisin has just published a new book, America the Beautiful and Violent, Black Youth and Trauma in Chicago, where he lived for 2 decades. I'm looking forward to Dexter's insights about neighborhood violence from the context of economic and racial inequality tonight. But first, we have a special treat for our community. And I believe it's the first of a kind for us. And so I'd like to say a few words to mark the occasion. Often in public health, we focus very much on data analysis, and we forget the valuable role that the humanities and the arts can play in the education and really sort of improvement of our entire efforts. I'm happy to say that in the health sciences overall, especially in our medical schools, they're bringing humanities into the curriculum as a way to teach empathy and better communication skills to future physicians. And I'd love to see more of this in public health. And I'm grateful to our Black and Indigenous leaders for showing us the way. For Black History Month, we've got several opportunities to engage with the visual and the performing arts. This helps us to understand complex human experience within communities, including the impacts of issues like anti-Black racism, and yet how excellence and resilience still persevere. These types of learnings help bring the statistics alive and foster an evolution in our critical thinking and in our work. Research shows that training the arts and humanities makes for better, more effective doctors, and I believe it'll do the same for public health. So thank you, Ryan, and everyone who's helping to lead our school forward in this valuable way. And with that, let's go to our spoken word poetry performance. Amoya Reè is a Jamaican-Canadian performance poet and the 2018 Canadian National Champion. She began exploring performance poetry in 2008, and since then she has shared her stories in various settings and locations across Ontario. Her writing is rooted in her lived experience as an immigrant, a mother, and a community worker. Amoya was recently crowned the 2021 Toronto Grand Slam champion and has received grants from the Ontario Arts Council and the very prestigious Canada Council for the Arts. She continues to write the stories that are always the most difficult to hear and has made it her mission to make her authentic voice come through in her poetry. And we're looking forward to her debut poetry collection. And so with that, it's my very great pleasure to welcome Amoya Reè to our school. And with that, I'll turn the microphone over to her now. Thank you, Amoya.
Thank you for that beautiful, absolutely beautiful introduction. And thank you to the entire School of Public Health for inviting me into this space. Thank you to everyone who is watching and holding space for me. The beauty of words is that we're able to tell the stories that often cannot be compiled into data and science and cannot be measured in the ways that most of us in this room today understand. So I'm thankful that everyone here is allowing space for this type of energy exchange. I'm going to be sharing 2 poems with you today. And while I can't see everybody, I'm expecting the energy to come through. So if you've ever been to a poetry slam, after you hear a piece of poetry, you can snap, you can clap, you can grunt, you could feel it in your body, in your soul, wherever it hits you. But please allow yourself to feel. The Black child asks, what's the point of living if they just want to kill us all? This is my response. Somewhere, right now, there is a Black mother waiting for a child to arrive. Somewhere, there is a Black mother praying to every god, wishing on every single star for a child to bloom, to unravel into a garden, honeysuckle and ghost flowers, lilies to line a wanting smile, to become the lush greenery that grows after a lifetime of hurricanes, to not just withstand the storm, but to become it, obliterate the wind scale. Mother storm chaser waits to witness the rhapsody of rising, to erupt from the depths a diamond, knows the pricelessness of rarities, wants the child's gift wrapped in gold, wants the package to read fragile, handle with care, wants the shipping label to read, please return to sender, knows that the child might come home in pieces, but at least they will come home. And in this metaphor, you are the prized possession. So today you will survive for survival's sake. Today you will open your eyes and know that your body did not fail you. Today you will stretch your hands and grab at the sun. Be your own tender embrace. Let the intrusive thoughts melt away from the warmth of it all. For each body that wonders if they are enough. There's a mother who has already written her name on your heart, has already whispered your spirit to her ancestors. Somewhere, someone is asking questions when they themselves are the answer. And yesterday might not have been enough to hold your entire story. So today, you might just mumble through the lines, skip over the trigger words and land on the pause. And there you will walk in the sun, past a fruit stand and squeeze for freshness, delight in the possibilities of growth, of your own sweetness. Today you will be joy. Glory be the spring that appears after all this frost. Today you will clap when you land at your own reflection. You deserve all the applause and the accolades. Hold the acceptance speech and be still. Be still. For you are enough. So when we talk about the ways in which we have to advocate for ourselves, we also have to remember the people like all of you who are doing the work, who are doing the learning to advocate for the rest of us. I'm thankful to all of you for your knowledge, your expertise, and your dedication to making our lives better. I'm also aware that it can also be very frightening, especially when you don't fit the picture and you have to force everyone else to see beyond that picture, the bigger picture, so to speak. This piece, I want to talk about that fear, and I want to talk about how important it is to look fair right in the eye. And I hope this piece inspires you to continue to push the boundaries, to continue to think beyond what we are expected to think. Dear fear, where did you come from? See, at first I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. You know, like those things they tell you when you're 3. It's just your imagination. Stop complaining, be a big girl, be like my mother, with her skin like freshly brewed iced tea and just as cold, with her magnetic hips that support her steel frame back that always seems to bend but never breaks. And I seem to have inherited her every trait, so I wonder if she too feels that tingle at her nape. Do the hairs on the back of her neck stand up straight when her boyfriend raises his hand above his head? Or is it just at the thought of her babies no longer being fed if she leaves? And I want to tell her that she's wrong. I want to tell her to move out of her way and give her warrior pass, but then I look into those deep set brown eyes, unsure of the disease that lives there, and then I realize it's fear. They say memory is literally embedded in our DNA. So why can't I remember whose body you first took over? Whose life did you first destroy with your tapeworm parasitic, only thriving because I let you, residue of pain, entity that can't seem to let me breathe, arriving at the most inopportune times, like periods when you're wearing all white. You disgust me. And I know you are unnatural because you were not there to stop Eve. I search my bloodstream with every lash I receive as a result of you, and the question still remains, who sent for you? I wonder, how did Sarah Bartman control you? How did Henrietta Lacks manage to live as long as you? Did Corin Gaines not know of your power? And how do I, daughter of gods and kings, I, reincarnation of ancestors who sang for, danced for, and healed men who worshipped at their feet, I, keeper of humanity in my womb, I, sister of shadows who freed slaves in the night, I, mother of maroons, I, kinfolk to high priestesses, I, friend to the moon, I, ocean and earth blood, I, black sky with stars for eyes, I, steel wool and silk, I, land of honey and milk, I am the land of honey and milk, I, prize of war, I, casualty of war, I am warrior, and you, fear, will not destroy me or control me. You will sit under my tongue like stale gum. You will hide in the corner of my mouth until I find somewhere worthy to spit you out. You will come only when called, speak only when spoken to. Remember your place, fear. For when my magical gleam begins to dull, and my fire begins to fade, you are only a small, small part of that fuel. Thank you.
I don't know who decided that I would speak after that, but that I got to figure out how to do that differently. Amoya, thank you so much for that powerful, moving and thoughtful performance. You know, there's not a lot I can say after that to sort of express how rich that was. Not just, I'm sure, not just for me. So thank you for sort of setting the tone in a different way, and we really appreciate that. Thank you again. It is very clear why you are a champion. That was excellent. Thank you so much. Hard to move on, but from that brilliant performance and in sort of the same thoughtful energy, I want to ask Dr. Essu and Dr. Beverley Essue and Dr. Dexter Voisin to join us. I won't spend too much time reading through bios because, you know, if you're here, you know who they are. And I think you'll get a much richer sense of who they are through this discussion. After this this discussion and this sort of chat that we get to sit in and watch, we'll have a Q&A section where we get to ask questions, of course. So please feel free to put your questions in, and we'll definitely have that conversation and post those questions to our speakers. So I'm going to turn it over to Beverly and Dexter, and welcome everyone.
Well, I'd also like to add a warm welcome to all our listeners this evening. And Dr. Essue, we've passed cross briefly while I was at the University of Toronto, and I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to be in conversation with you this afternoon, conversation around Black excellence, Black research, Black authorship, and the portrayal of full Black lives. Anytime I meet someone new, I always start the conversation, for me as a social work scientist, but also as a practitioner, I'm always curious about an individual's personal story. And tonight we are talking about excellence. Could you share with us a little bit, what are some of your identities and how has excellence been a part of your narrative?
Thank you. And I echo, it's wonderful to have an opportunity to be here with you tonight and to have a chance to get to know each other a little bit more in this intimate, what feels very intimate discussion. So, you know, I think the very, you know, important place to start is that I am a first generation Canadian. My parents are from the Caribbean, from Jamaica and from St. Lucia. And I grew up in a community where most others around me were also children of immigrants to Canada. And so that sort of immigrant experience features very strongly in my early memories. And I've always identified very strongly with Caribbean culture, because it's really sort of all that I really knew. So, you know, grew up dancing in Kitty's Carnival from a very young age, attending cultural events all throughout the year, never really questioning why we ate liver for breakfast or oxtail before it became in vogue and started being sold at Longo's. So, you know, I grew up surrounded by very strong examples of culture and pride in community and indeed pride in family in my immediate surroundings. And I think that coupled with, I come from a family with very strong matriarchs and very strong female role models. And so have been encouraged from a very young age to find your voice and have a voice and an opinion and make it heard. You know, I'm one of 5 kids, 4 of which are females and very strong personalities. And so you had to have a voice or you know, be lost in the shadows. So these very early experiences, I feel, you know, anchored me as a person and framed the way that I viewed the world and my position as well as my privilege in the world. I think it's, you know, in reflecting on this question, one of the things that features to me is that excellence was not this one thing that was defined for me or was imposed on me. It's something that I could identify in the different lived experiences that were around me and the way that people celebrated who they were and that freedom to be able to do that. And I think as a child of immigrant parents who came to Canada, separately, but they were the first of their family to arrive here, this concept of opportunity has always, featured very strongly in the backdrop of my life and that of my siblings. We were always told that it was important to create your own opportunities. You had to be prepared to work harder than the person sitting next to you. You had to be prepared for them to doubt you and then be surprised, be prepared for the surprise on their face when they realized actually that they shouldn't have doubted you. And it came from a very honest truth from a young age that this was necessary, and it was necessary to view opportunity through this lens because of the color of our skin, but also, being a female Black child growing up in this world. So I believe that fundamentally shaped the way that I view the world for the good, in a good way, and the way that I view what's possible. The other thing I'd say is that, this migrant experience has really been a thread through my narrative in important ways. So not just as a child of immigrant parents, I also lived and worked in the Caribbean in St. Lucia, where I sort of had my first exposures to work trying to deliver healthcare services in health systems that were severely low resourced, where people go to a pharmacy to purchase 1 to 2 Panadol pills at a time because you didn't buy the whole bottle, and paying for essential and basic healthcare services was a real impoverishing reality for everyday people. And first exposures to very extreme inequalities, fantastic resorts that people had their honeymoons at and lovely homes on the beach next to these real serious health system issues. And that motivated an interest in global health work and motivated a move to Australia, where I lived for a decade, as an immigrant in that country. I studied there, I did my doctoral work and sort of started my career. So, this strong migrant experience features very strong in my narrative, as well as a global gaze that I believe has pursued me to think about excellence in a way that it's, a desire to make the world a better place. I realize that's a bit of a cliche, but I think I've taken risks to create opportunities to pursue the things that I have thought were important and tried to do the best that I could along the way. And I think the last thing I'd say is that I've been very fortunate along this journey to not just, have it peppered, but strongly spiced, I'd say, with exceptional mentorship and exposure to very different representations of what excellence can and what it really should be. So that's, shaped my view of the way the world could be and should be. And so I've had an opportunity to share a little bit about my backstory. I wonder, Dexter, if you want to give us some reflections on yours, just to position this.
Well, Beverly, before I even respond to that, I'm hearing your backstory and I'm saying, wow, all the threads that you've just shared are so powerful and so personal and authentic, and talking about being Canadian, but still being immigrant Canadian, and navigating all these identities across these very spaces. As you were talking, I said, what would education be like if each instructor, before they started a class, was really encouraged to tell their story, to really sort of humanize and create this level of connection and intimacy. I felt closer to you in these first 3 minutes than I've ever had in all the other academic spaces we've interacted. And I think there's something powerful about telling our authentic story that really builds bridges. So anyway, I'm just really, really blown away. So I guess in many ways, we have similar but very different experiences. So I grew up in the Caribbean, in Trinidad. And I think, my positionality as the last child out of 3 siblings always sort of pushed me to excel because I was overlooked as the last child. So I always found ways to excel, to shine, so that I could get the attention of my older siblings and my parents. But it was really interesting because growing up in a country where many of the people looked like me, race was always in the background, particularly issues of colorism. But it wasn't like the big R in terms of racism. I call it like the small R. And I think any country that has been colonized, you can't escape racism and how we all contribute and consume racism on some level. So I was taught Black pride by my mother in terms of look your best, strive to be your best. But my mother at the same time, with her messages and the messages of colonial identities that she inherited, also taught me that whiteness was superior. So she taught me these two sort of messages that were in tension to each other. Be proud of your Black identity, but whiteness is superior. But I always had, I think, high school students who really shaped my identity around excellence. I remember very vividly, like it was yesterday, a math teacher, Mrs. Ackley, who always at the start of class said, if you fail to prepare, prepare to fail. And it was this whole notion around excellence. So I grew up with this notion of excellence was in my DNA, but not excellence because I was Black, but just excellence based on cultural pride and heritage. And when I migrated to the US, I realized how fortunate I was at an early formative age to have those messages really deposited inside of me, because now my skin color became a liability. And it was the first time in my life I had to check a box in terms of my racial identity. And I remember going into the student services office and being asked, what are you? White, Black, Asian, Latino, or other? And I stood there with that pen in my hand, probably for like 20 minutes, because it was like Alice going into the rabbit hole. I had never had to identify myself in a racialized category. And I was realized that as soon as I checked that box, I was taking all the stereotypes that were associated to that box onto myself. So I think that notion around excellence that I learned really propelled me forward throughout every aspect I've had in my life, and really helped me to sort of, I think, manage some of the assaults that came against me because of my racial identity, my racial presentation. So I was always the other Black person. So the only Black person in my class studying psychology, the only Black person on the dean's cohort list, right? The exceptional Black person. So I was either, I realized that in North American culture, in particular, Black identities are put into two extreme camps. You're either the exceptional, so you're this mystical creature that sort of defies the norm, or you're the monster in terms of, you know, the thug, the addict, and all the other sort of negative stereotypes. But that middle ground in terms of a full human being, I think very often Black folks are not afforded that space to be fully three-dimensional individuals. So you're either a mystical monster, but rarely ever the man or the woman, you know, with a full identity. So excellence has really been my bulletproof vest around moving through these spaces, and predominantly white spaces all of my life. In terms of my higher education, I've been fortunate to go to really well-resourced places, well-resourced institutions. But excellence has been my force field in terms of helping me to navigate those spaces and perform in ways sometimes that, as you mentioned, evokes that shock, right?
Yeah, it's you know, this sort of identity politics is really resonates, because I think as you would probably be aware, being, having a connection, being from the Caribbean, people look very different. And so even within my own family, my own immediate family, we all look a little different. And so have had many, many, many discussions around the extent to which people identify as Black, or even if you don't present looking like what people expect to be Black. And where my mind immediately went as you were speaking is, as we think about the importance, and this, is a very strong research bias I'm about to introduce here. When we think about how we move to a place where we can better understand the diversity of experiences, we in Canada, at least, we struggle to be able to really, really disaggregate data and information in a way to understand the diversity of experiences. And some of that challenge, I think, is linked to, it's not as simple as sort of saying, are you, those categories that you were presented with when you first went to college, right? Because there are all of these mixes here. And yet, even when we want to be able to capture that information, everyone is sort of quickly kind of filtered into the most obvious boxes. And that itself also creates a challenge for how people identify. And so it's a reflection that I have, and as you were sort of talking about the experience of moving to the States and having to navigate that.
Yeah, and I guess it goes back to, I think, what Staney and Amoya talked about in terms of a sort of reductionistic approach. So this assumption that Blackness represents this homogeneous identity. But we both ended up in Canada, but your experience in your journey in Canada and all the other places you've lived is very different than mine. And in terms of our generations and our backgrounds and gender and all these other types of identities. But again, it's the constraining of Black lives and how Black individuals are sometimes in literature, in arts, in science, the portrayal on television are not given the luxury or the opportunity to be portrayed on all these dimensions. We are portrayed as single dimensional, one-dimensional individuals. And I guess it's similar to, some of the challenges too with research on other racialized populations, right? So Asians and folks immediately think you're Chinese, right? And don't look at the complexity among, Asian identities. But we can go on talking about this for the next 20 or 30 minutes.
Yeah, I might just pick up and say one small anecdote before we transition. Ryan has heard me speak quite a lot about my kids and my involvement in their school, and I think there are very good intentions in terms of providing exposure to diverse experiences at the school, and so I commend them for that. But a very small example, that links to the representation. There were some resources that were put aside to be able to buy books to ensure that the books, reflected everyday regular people. And very quickly, the council only wanted to buy these books that sort of featured very prominent Black people in history. Also important to do, but it's this idea that we can only show representation of the sort of exceptionalism, or, they weren't showing the other end of the spectrum, but that you couldn't just have regular stories of people living their lives, of families, of, Lola Goes to the Library is one of our favorite books, and that's just Lola going to the library with her mom. And that there is this middle ground to demystify these extreme notions of what we think that experience should be. And I don't know that we've, mainstreamed that enough, certainly at a younger age. And so then it becomes harder to identify it later on when we're trying to research it and we're trying to understand it within an academic context. So I wanted to throw that anecdote in there.
Well, Beverly, you're making it hard for us to move on to this particular topic, but I'm just going to add one thing to it. I jokingly say that very often, particularly Black men, are either seen as mystical in terms of the magician. They're going to come there, you're the first of anything, you're going to come and correct all the ills in a very short period of time, right? Or you're seen as a monster, but rarely ever a man in terms of a three-dimensional person, right? You talked about representation, and when you talked about books, I think, when George Floyd happened, there was such a huge outcry in terms of having Black scholars. I'm sure you got a lot of these calls to come talk and to present. And very often I would ask folks, what's the reason for this? Well, George Floyd, and I think it's really important for our racialized staff and faculty to see an example of a successful Black person. So going back to the exceptional narrative, right? The magician, the mystical person, the person who defies the common narrative on the tail end. And I would always say that, Black representation is not just important for Black and brown bodies, to boost their self-esteem. It's important for white bodies, for all bodies, that folks can see that excellence doesn't only show up in white male bodies or white female bodies. Black representation is important for white students, for Asian students, for Black students, for all students. It doesn't just benefit Black and brown people, right? So even sometimes again, this is where we are all consumers of racism and racist ideology that we've all been taught. Even in wanting to move the dial, sometimes we don't recognize that sometimes our ask is still replicating the same ideology that we're trying to refute. And I say, when I stand in the classroom, this is for white students, not just for Black students. They need to see that Black leadership can also be excellent. All right, so let's move on.
I mean, I think it's a good segue because you have been leading such important work to understand and to describe the rich and complex narratives of Black people that have, often, to this discussion we've just been having immediately about, that have often been flattened and sort of scripted and described from a deficit, sort of pathological invisibility stance in the arts, in the literature and culture and health sciences, and in many other fields. So I wonder if you can, speak to how your work has really sought to challenge that and debunk it and create more of a fulsome narrative of the Black experience.
Yeah, and I think, one of the ways that I've really tried to bring that to the fore is in my book, America, the Beautiful and Violent. And although it's subtitled Black Youth and Neighborhood Trauma in Chicago, it could be easily called Canada, the Beautiful and Violent, the United Kingdom, the Beautiful and Violent, because although I use Chicago as a case study, it's really representative, I think, of many Black experiences across the diaspora. And, I mentioned that for many years, I worked as a social work practitioner before I became an academic and an administrator. But over the last 5 or 6 years, I became increasingly disturbed by the public portrayals of young Black folks, reporters calling me and saying, a baby has been shot by a random bullet. Can you tell me the psyche of a gang member? What goes on in the mind of a gang member? And violence is totally unacceptable. Homicides is something that, happens way too frequently and is a tragedy. But again, the sort of flattening the narratives of these young people in terms of villain and victim. And then when I started, through my research over the years, really recalling what many of these young people were talking about, growing up without fathers, being placed in child welfare, simply because of the zip codes that they were living in. Or in Canada, we call it the postal codes, where you have high policing, where you have the extraction of Black and brown male bodies out of those homes into the prison system, where you have a higher number of kids in the child welfare system, and you have the destabilizing of those families, and schools that warehouse kids and don't educate them. And those young people moving into alternative economies. I started saying, who are the victims here, right? And who are the villains? And really looked at structural issues that really implicated all of us. And I really wanted to tell their stories, use my position as a Black academic in privileged spaces to tell their stories. Their stories that were ahistorical, decontextualized, where they were presented as singular individuals without context to how they came to be who they are. And one person but I was a student because he was teaching me. So many of the lessons I learned from these young people, there's an old saying, out of the mouth of babes. And he said to me, Dr. Dexter, you know, all this stuff about violence, all this stuff about gangs, you know what it's all about? Resources, access to resources. Right? He just broke it down in the most simple yet complex terms. It's all about resources. And, you know, when I look at a Canadian context and when I lived in Canada, there was this notion around Canadian exceptionalism and the treatment of race. And sometimes I would say the invisibility to treatment of race. And Canada by far it's such a welcoming community and country with less gun violence in the US. But when we scratch beneath the surface, we realize that many of the issues that plague Blacks in the United States are very much there in Canada. The rate in terms of the disproportionality of Black youth in the child welfare system in Toronto approximates the disproportionality rate of Black youth in Mississippi and Alabama, right? In Canada, the beautiful, right? The housing segregation index in Toronto is exactly the same as a housing segregation index in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where Mr. George Floyd was murdered, right? So, you know, and I think that is a story that needed to be told. And it's a story that I tell in the book, but it's a story that I think resonates very much with the complexity and the politics of Black life in Canada.
And so, you know, through your work and the research that you've done to sort of reframe this narrative, are you seeing a shift, or is it the same? You know, let me reframe the question. I think there has been an effort to change the perspective with which we describe the Black experience, and particularly for Black males. And there has been important leadership in this space by scholars such as yourself. But the extent to which it is mainstreamed, the way in which that experience features within research, have you seen that shift happening, or is it still sitting in parallel to this deficit approach to the research? Like, how much are they cross-pollinating to create the sort of change that I think you're calling for?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, change comes slowly, but I'm optimistic of change. And this is where I talk about our generational status. So Beverly, I've been in the academy almost 30 years now. And, you know, when I entered the academy in 1995, I can tell you folks who were studying Black identity, racism, acculturation, those folks would go on the market in elite institutions, and it would be like they had the scarlet letter on their back. Folks were very nervous about those topics in predominantly white institutions. Since post-George Floyd, we're seeing such a large call for scholars who are doing work in this area, cluster hires, right? Elite institutions are saying, we want people who are studying racism. We want people who are studying, you know, disproportionality. We want folks who are studying the Black arts, right? And there's now, I think, more of an embracing. So what was seen as a sort of sideline, not popular topic has now become popularized. I think part of the challenge, so I think the complexion literally of the academy is changing. But I think there's also this misnomer that social justice research or research on inequality or health disparities is social justice. And it's not. There's a difference between research on health disparities, research on social justice versus social justice in the academy. Social justice in the academy is when folks who are qualified have access to the academy. Folks like you and me who can occupy spaces in these elite institutions, and we could pursue the questions that we're interested in pursuing. So I think in 2022, we are still hearing about the first Black person in leadership in a particular institution, the first Black hire in this department, right? That does not signal social justice. Even though we have 90 people studying social justice topics or health inequalities, it goes back to what Marcus says, it's all about access to resources. And then the type of questions that we ask, are there questions, again, that are framing the Black experience from a deficit standpoint, comparing Black outcomes to white outcomes? Of course, those outcomes are going to be different. We are living in different social ecologies, right? Have different opportunities. Are we looking at questions around resiliency, right? Are we looking at subgroups of the Black experience in terms of Black folks who are doing better than other subgroups and not having to compare them to white populations in order to have significance to those questions? I think that is more of a movement that closer approximates social justice.
Yeah, and I mean, I think striving to move away, just back to the point you were making about evolution within the academy, not seeing these changes as sort of tokenistic and a sort of counting of sticks. Well, we already have that person who does that thing, so we don't need any more. But actually striving to see a shift in the way that we're asking questions and the sort of research. And I think, this has to penetrate. It starts with the sort of, faculty that exist within the space, but it's more fundamental in terms of the change, because I think there's, we rely on a peer review. So this sort of others' perception of the value of this work dictates the extent to which one progresses, because ultimately you're being judged by others in terms of how important the work is seen. Does it make it through funding, like funding reviews? Do funders view this as important work? Are they looking for equity work to be doing a certain thing, or are they actually investing in trying to do some of that transformative social justice work? And I think some of those fundamental shifts we're seeing, from my perspective, we're seeing signals that some of that is starting to change, but hopefully that momentum is sustained, I think.
Yeah, and I've definitely seen a slight change over the past 30 years. So we talk about incrementalism. I've definitely seen a change in the academy. I think part of it also relies on an appreciation that Black scholars very often are going to be using methods, going to be doing a lot of applied work that's not necessarily secondary data analysis. They're going to be building relationships with community partners. And that requires additional stepping stones and processes that might not be inherent in just a linear approach to work. And that we have to account for these processes that don't necessarily result in a peer review publication immediately as real legitimate output. Mm. And you mentioned the point around tokenism and checking the black box. I remember at one institution where I was interviewing when I was on the job market as an assistant professor, a well-meaning colleague said, wow, we get 3 for the price of 1. We have a Black male, we have someone with an immigrant international experience, and I forgot what was the third box, they attributed to me. So it was like 3 for the price of 1. Okay, we checked that box. And one of the things that I learned that the University of Toronto, my time there, is really framing this conversation around inclusive excellence. So it's less about meeting a quota or checking a box. But when we talk about inclusive excellence, what does that mean? Who needs to be around the table to help us develop a fulsome understanding of this particular phenomena? And I think about it as looking through a keyhole. If you look through a keyhole, you only see one slice of that room. And we need folks with multiple keyholes who can look through and create a full 360 of that room, right? Because we all have blind spots, we all have limitations. We've all been taught what is important, who's important, what questions, based on the sort of upbringing that we've all been exposed to, as you so eloquently talked about your experience and how it shaped your identities. So I think, again, language is important. So moving away from this, I think really 1970s, 80s term around diversity and the check mark, and thinking more broadly around inclusive excellence, right? Very often diversity is seen as, okay, is this a code for quality? Diversity and excellence somehow doesn't seem to go together in elite spaces, right? So we want to be diverse, but how could we maintain our quality, right? So they're seen as two opposite polars. Versus when we talk about exclusive excellence, we are really marrying excellence and diversity as one, right? As one being central to the next.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think as I think about, what would it take to redefine excellence, right, within the academy, and why is there this tendency to think about, we're having a discussion about diversity, and then we immediately go to the way in which we are potentially trading off excellence, and then the extension of that is how we need to ensure there's mentoring and support and capacity development. So the signal is right, we're trying to do the right thing, we quickly go back to this deficit perspective in terms of what those positions, what space those positions will hold, and not using it as an opportunity to see excellence redefined. Maybe this is too utopian, but excellence can look differently. Back to the sort of experience that I was trying to reflect on in my opening remarks, that it can and should look different. And we have these old notions about excellence that we are now trying to fit new people and new experiences and a new way of working into an old mold and an old model. And the extent to which some of those structural changes are happening are not aligning with the efforts to, change the space. I think the other thing I was reflecting on as you were speaking is that there's also this, burden is not necessarily the right way to describe it, but an expectation maybe is a better way to frame it, that individuals that are coming in that have, that reflect diverse experiences will necessarily take up the charge of doing the work to progress Black health, to progress issues that are relevant to their particular communities. And, I was reflecting on a discussion I had with a new postdoc who rightfully asked, am I expected to only do work that's relevant to progressing Black health? Is that the expectation? Because I am Black. And I said, no, that's not the expectation. You should do the work that you find interesting. And this point that I made around, being able to carve out the opportunities and define them for oneself and do good work that then, excel is a lever to excel. I think there is a tendency to want to create these niche spaces and define what it should look like, which is also restrictive and, a colonial way of thinking about this space. And, I think, maybe I'll pause there and see if you want to react.
No, what you're saying really resonates with me. And again, my experience has been in predominantly white institutions. And I think it's public knowledge, it's no secret that if you look at the historical origins of these institutions, they were predominantly set up for white men. White women were not even part of the equation. white women had to claw their way into these institutions, right, to find space, to elbow their way into these institutions. So you look at the Harvard, you look at, University of Toronto, you look at University of Chicago, and all these elite institutions, they were primarily created for white men. So again, when we're talking about people of color, you're talking about several different iterations down in terms of, opening space. So again, the questions that Black scholars come in and want to ask, and very often they're told either explicitly or implicitly that that is not a valid question. So when I was doing research on the high rates of STIs among young Black adolescents and really trying to understand what relationship, if any, neighborhood violence had to that, and if so, what were the pathways accounting for that? I was told that that is not a researchable problem because where's my white sample? Unless I have a white sample to compare the Black youth to, it was not a legitimate question. And it's similar to, the anti-Black racism movement across many campuses. When George Floyd happened, many schools were challenged in terms of not wanting to name it anti-Black racism, wanting to call it something much broader, right? Like anti-structural racism, but not identify or focus specifically on Black folks without piggybacking those issues to other groups is legitimate unto itself. So I think there's a parallel there, and the same sort of restraint of Black lives in society by these systems of care, child welfare, the school system, racial housing segregation. It's a similar parallel that Black scholars experience in the academy, being restrained, being boxed in, right? Our colonial ideologies basically signaling what is a legitimate question, what you have the right to study. So white scholars could study about Black individuals, Latinx, and so on. But if you're a Black scholar, very often you're constrained to study things related to your population, right? If you go outside, it's like, well, do you have the expertise? Which is not a question that's asked of white scholars, right? And then sometimes, if you do questions within that area, you'll get another set of questions. Do you have the objectivity because you're so close to the subjects, right? Particularly if you're doing qualitative methods, right? So you're restrained and compressed on both sides around legitimacy of inquiry and legitimacy of your capacity, right? But again, that's something that we've all inherited and we replicate, I think sometimes both Black, white, and others, based on the consumption of racism, which we've all been socialized to. And I would say this, and some folks will come at me, and that we all consume and perpetuate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a fair reflection. I think the perpetuating piece is because not to some extent, to a large extent, in order to function well in some of these spaces. I mean, you reflected that you have worked in many institutions that are predominantly white. I think, living in Australia for 10 years where they have a very complicated relationship with race. And, there was nobody really that looked that like the Caribbean population did not migrate to Australia. So there was a very small amount of Caribbean people that are there, and a very complex relationship with their indigenous populations. And so to some extent, you learn to conform to some extent in order to fit the mold that is seen to succeed. But I think that we're in this space now where the questioning is creating the cracks that are required to be able to challenge that, I think, in a way that's being heard, and I say I'm hopeful that is sustained. So I wonder if you can reflect. I know we're getting close to the question and answer time, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on the way, we both We both have Black identities, which we've reflected on. We both have these lived experiences as researchers, both in Canada and elsewhere. But we come from different disciplines, and we come at this work from different disciplinary perspectives. And so I wonder if you can reflect on how social work, the social work discipline in particular, has attempted or struggled to craft an anti-colonial narrative towards Black life and experiences. You started to sort of pick it up here and there.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think, you know, for me, I became an accidental social worker probably about 30 years ago on my way to becoming a psychologist. I just happily stumbled into the profession of social work. And, you know, I really feel that I found a home and a place and a calling. But, you know, our profession has done a lot of good and contributed to a lot of good in society in terms of mental health, in terms of addressing populations that have been left behind in the child welfare system, in the prison system, and in so many other spaces, and even outside of traditional social services. Yet at the same time, we've also caused harm in those settings. So we look at the Indigenous residential school systems and the path of social workers in Canada really contributing to that, right? The child welfare system in Canada, which is predominantly staffed by social workers, but social workers, sometimes because they're not properly well trained within the profession, we are taught to look at biases external to the profession and to society, but very often not really trained to address biases and inequality within the profession. That we produce social workers who go out and replicate some of these harms to vulnerable populations. And I mentioned earlier, when we are talking still in 2021, 2022 about the first Black dean at an elite school, that tells you it's a signal that we haven't addressed racism within the profession, right? Although we're very much focused on racism without. So I think there's still a lot of tensions within the profession that we are trying to grapple with, both in terms of how well are we preparing students to go out and to do anti-oppressive practice, anti-Black racism practice, right? Address anti-Black racism in practice. So it's something that we are still struggling with. But I'm really heartened that you have more leadership across social work institutions where people are talking about these issues and saying that we've done some good, we've also done some harm. How could we lessen the harm and do more good? And again, in the area of scholarship is another area. I've said to folks, I'm not interested in looking at Black-white disparities in my line of research, because obviously they would exist because folks are living in different resource or under-resourced communities. So very mindful of the questions that we ask, that is not continuing to perpetuate a colonial narrative around a deficit experience around the lives of Black people. What is it like in public health? I know nursing is now talking about social determinants of health, and public health has latched onto this phrase for the past maybe almost 2 decades. How is your profession trying to grapple with some of these issues, particularly as it relates to the Black experience?
Yeah, so I mean, I come at this from a global health perspective, which is where I sort of situate most of my work. And I think it's fair to say that global health is really grappling with an identity crisis at the moment. That's been bubbling for some time. But I think, you know, the events over the last couple years, not only like the pandemic, obviously unearthing these insidious inequalities that have existed for time, but we're happy to not really focus too much on them. It's hard to look away what has been revealed over the last 2.5 years. And I think, of course, the events around George Floyd's death and so many others over the last few years have really forced long ignored discussions around race and tolerance for racism. And so in global health, we are, the discussions are really centering around this rejection of a colonial model on which global health was established. And there are very strong calls to decolonize global health and to shift this power dynamic away from academic institutions that, sit within the global north, and predominantly led by white scholars for the most part, in defining the questions and defining the data and having ownership over the data, and really trying to recognize that actually locally derived questions, locally derived ownership of that information has to be the way in which we move forward within the profession. And, very recently there's these, it didn't take too long to be able to do some analysis of who is writing on global health. And it's shocking, like 30% of authors are based at low and middle income country institutions, publishing on global health. So the literature itself, the scholarship itself is dominated. And I say this as somebody who does work on global health and is based at an institution in a high income country. There hasn't been the sort of commitment to forge legitimate relationships and partnerships and co-creation, and indeed maybe not even co-creation, but supporting the creation of knowledge from the local perspective. And I think as I reflect on what opportunities this creates to change, I just don't think that we go back to the way the world used to be. I think there's a demand. I am involved. It involves as a section editor on a journal that focuses on low and middle income country policy and planning. And that journal, in addition to many other journals, are making requirements around, how do you justify submitting a paper on X country without any authors that from this country? So, how do you reflect on that now at the very end when the paper is being written up? So there's a real pushback that means I don't think we will go back. And it means that we have to rethink how, what does it mean to develop this work and have recognition for it to push the field of global health in its own right in the direction it needs to go within those countries, but also for scholars who are working from the sidelines where we probably should be working. What does that mean for our own progression, for our own, when I think it's fair to say Canada's approach to global health, or I might be criticized for this, but Canada's approach to global health has been what's in it for us. And a lot of it there's nothing in it for us. And so when we're then assessed by, again, these traditional metrics for progression, where you don't have enough first authorship papers, you haven't brought in the grants, we have to be willing to give that power up and shift the structure in order to have the power sit with those who should, authentically and legitimately hold power. And it's a confronting state for global health. I think it's really revealing a lot of fragility among those who have been the leaders and the pillars of global health in these institutions around the world, because it's hard to give that up, and the funding that has come with those structures.
Well, and as you were talking about having authors from those middle to low income countries on publications, I would even add not just having them as window dressing, because folks can be on those publications and have no power or say in terms of how the research was conducted. Real life kicking in, right? How the research was conducted, or in some of the decisions being made. One of the things that I'm really excited and proud about at Case Western University, we have a community advisory board. And a lot of folks say, oh, community advisory board, but this is a community advisory board with real teeth, where the community members actually say what research is going to take place in their communities. They sit with the researchers and they decide together the type of questions that are going to be asked, right? So that board has real power. And I think that's how we really bring people to the table with an equal footing, and not just do research on communities, right? But research alongside communities. And, obviously a city like Toronto is much bigger and it's harder to sort of have that type of engagement. But I think there are ways we really need to move the dial towards true social justice, which means bringing them to the table to even vet the type of questions being asked. When I was writing that book, America the Beautiful and Violent, the same young man said to me, Why do you want to write this book? Who would care? And how would you tell the story? And I know we need to wrap up now and take some questions, but it goes back to one of my favorite quotes. Until the lions write their own histories, the tale of the hunt would always glorify the hunter. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a parallel for that in research, right? If those communities don't have a say in the stories that are being told about them, which starts with the questions that are being asked about them, then the knowledge we produce and reproduce would continue to reproduce a colonial deficit narrative. So, I look forward to having conversations with you in other spaces, Beverly, and maybe we turn it over to Ryan now to bring in some audience questions.
Thank you so much, Beverly and Dexter. We definitely could listen to you guys have more of this conversation until we wrap up. I'm going to throw a few questions at you. I think we had a few come in, and I'll start with this one. So I'm going to try to combine a few questions so we can sort of get a lot of questions in a limited amount of time. So in your respective roles in academic circles and institutions, how do you personally grapple with the notion of tokenism while operating in a white dominant structure? And I'm kind of combining that with another question around sort of what's the responsibility that you feel and the pressure that you feel as Black identifying individuals in this sort of space, and maybe continuing with that, what should institutions or your colleagues be doing, maybe non-Black colleagues, to sort of alleviate that? And is that sort of the right approach? So I'll turn that over to you.
I'll just jump in first. I think it goes back to this notion of excellence that I was taught as a child. And when I came to the States and to Canada, I realized that those early childhood lessons, that excellence is the best antidote to racism or any other type of ism. And you reference, feeling what some folks call the Black tax, right? The Black tax from communities of color, when you're one of a few that's represented in a position of leadership, you have folks from your communities who have high expectations from you, because it might be the first time they see someone like themselves showing up in these spaces. But then you also have folks who have other narratives that they try to impose upon you, narratives of deficit and otherwise, right? So there's a lot of pressure. There's no getting around that. And I think part of it, again, is moving away from the N of one. I've said to senior colleagues and administrators at other institutions that as long as you have an N of one, it reeks of tokenism. Because folks can always discount your excellence and say, oh, you're just there because you check a box. It's not until you have, let's say, more women in a particular field or more Black folks in a particular field, then it's no longer an issue of tokenism. So you have, let's say, one white woman or one Black woman in a law office full of white men. But now you have three. It's no longer about checking a box, right? That sends a different narrative. And when colleagues have said to me, Dexter, we really want you to serve on this and do that. And I said, I'm really happy to take up this opportunity in this space. But let's be clear, part of my contributions to these committees or these visible roles is not only the contributions I bring as a social work scholar, but the contributions I bring as a Black social work scholar, the perspectives that I bring through these multiple identities. And it just means there needs to be more of us. And one of the things that I'm really proud of during my time at Toronto is that in the short period of time I was there, when I came in, there was one Black dean. When I left, there were three. Right, and more Black people promoted to higher leadership. So I think these things can happen once there's a will and there's a commitment from leadership. And when folks talk about structural racism, I said the structural racism is us. It's people like us creating these systems. They're not aliens, it's us, right? Once we externalize to something structural and forget that they're human actors that are also part of these structures with a will and an ability to act, then sometimes we could pass it off on somebody else's responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, I would only just add that, and it feels like first principles to say this, that like the diversity that one has around the table will only ever enrich whatever it is you're doing, right? And so if you have just one, then I mean, you're really missing out on the opportunity. And I think there's been a lot more being written about lack of females within leadership. But coming at that with an intersectional lens, there's a lack of diverse women in leadership. I think when you start to look for Black women in leadership within the health system, it's like counting on single hands, right? And so the change has to happen by recognizing and valuing the different perspectives that people bring, because it then will not all fall on the individual shoulders of the select few that are there. And I think when we start to revision and reimagine what excellence looks like, it becomes very clear that that cannot be defined from one perspective. And so, I think it's getting to this understanding, but also recognizing that if we move from a checkbox sort of situation, we're actually trying to seek out this range of perspectives to make the work that we do better. And so, I mean, everything that Dexter said, I would agree with in terms of, there is this burden that one can face to be invited along to be the voice of this thing, right? And I have found throughout my entire career, I try to ask the hard questions, which sometimes can have the effect of then continuing to be invited to things. But you ask the hard questions because it forces everybody around us to think through, what is the rationale for this? Why are we doing this? And through that experience, hopefully I'm not the only person who has to ask those questions, that it's forcing us to think outside the box, and trying to push that forward, I think has some level of a success, I think.
Yeah, and I think it goes back, Beverly, to, because you have a Black person, a woman around the table, they do not speak for the plethora of Black experiences. That is not representative of all Black experiences, right? And it's something that seems a little bit sort of folly to be saying in 2022, but I think it's something that folks overlook, right? There's no singular Black experience, and your experience and my experience and how we came to a common Canadian institution just tells you that our paths are so different, right? Our experiences are so different.
Thank you both for that. And we got a few, so I'm going to try to run through some of them quickly. So, so this one I will say to both yourself, Dexter and Beverly. So with all the talk about democracy at risk, and largely men wanting to grab back what was being lost, how does that impact the gains made in inclusiveness?
Okay, so repeat the first part again, please. Something.
Right. With all the talk about democracy at risk, largely men wanting to grab back what was being lost, how does that impact the gains made in inclusiveness?
Okay, so if I'm sort of reading the levels to that question, if they're referring to identity politics, and I think this tension that if you decenter whiteness or you decenter the white gaze, then somehow folks are losing while some folks are gaining. That's my interpretation of the question, right? And particularly through an American lens, where we have a lot of racialized politics around people feeling that their identities and their histories, their colonial histories, are being erased. I'll just respond to that by a quote and I love quotes because I think they say a lot in a short period of time. It says, "To anyone who has unearned privilege, equality would seem like oppression." That's all I would say about that. And I think that goes for men when they think about including women into spaces that women have been traditionally shut out. Then it seems some men would say, hey, my rights are being erased, right? We bring in women on board, we have to act differently. That goes for folks who are heteronormative and you bring in sexual minorities. That goes for folks who have race privilege, any privilege that's unearned, immigration, nationality. You know, when I was in Canada, folks would say, oh, I was sitting in a food court and someone said, oh my God, all these immigrants we're bringing into Toronto, we're losing our identity, right? The city is going to crap, right? So again, anytime folks have had unearned privilege, equality or inclusion seems like oppression. And I think the flip side of this, the reality is that when we have more inclusion in society and less disparities, we have overall better population health. So actually the reverse is true. So you look at Canada that has a more equitable distribution of healthcare systems. Canadians live on average longer than the average American. Because in America, we have more inequality in healthcare, right? So the reverse is absolutely true to the myth that if I bring other people around the table, somehow my experience, my quality of life is diminished, while the opposite is true.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a finite thing, right? And it's something that I was taught very early in my training is that we shouldn't be seeing ourselves as sort of succeeding on the backs of others, that, you know, we can celebrate success of others as part of our own story, and we should look to bring each other up. And so the positioning that in order to create an inclusive space means you're foregoing the privilege and opportunity of others is not, I believe, coming at it through the right lens. I think we have to be willing to understand the privilege that we hold and be able to use that privilege to create space for others to hold some power. And that does require some shifting of power dynamics, which really reveals a fragility in people who have a hard time giving that up. But I think we have to understand it from the more positive lens in the way that Dexter described it. And this is not a finite space. This is a space that we will all exceed and excel and strengthen the academy or whatever space we're working in if we embrace inclusivity and diversity.
And maybe I'll take a little sort of philosophical stance on this, because I'm probably the oldest person on this call here. So I'll use my age privilege. And, you know, I very often think about, you know, some wise sayings where, you know, there's a time for everything under the sun. And at the end of the day, we all go back to the same place, right? We take nothing with us, regardless of how much we've accumulated in life. We take nothing with us. And I think, as one wise scholar, philosopher said, that the rent we pay for being on this planet is the service that we do for others. That is the rent that we pay on this planet, the service that we do for others, in terms of the time that we're here, that we can make a path easier for someone else, whether they look like us or not. And I guess that comes also from my social work philosophy and the mission around social work and why I got into social work. So I think about, you know, the fallacy around greed, that we collect, and sometimes we collect at the expense of others. But at the end of the day, we take none of these things with us.
Thanks so much for that, Dexter, and for those comments as well, Beverly. One question that was posed to something that Dexter had mentioned, I think it's a sort of a good challenge question, and I want to hear the sort of response to this. Someone mentioned that, so they're interested in what Dexter said around Black and white comparisons and how it perpetuates racism. Now, could you speak a bit more to that, Dexter? And so as that person who's doing some research in Black health, the thought is that there could be some value in that comparison to the dominant culture or people group.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I don't, and I said that, and I didn't intend it to make a blanket statement. So I think, health disparities and looking at Black-white comparisons are important in terms of scientific knowledge and development. But I think if we just stop there and we don't frame it around the social drivers or the ecology, then we can end up perpetuating a colonial narrative. So when we talk about at-risk youth, and we use terms like that, and we frame a question in terms of Black-white outcomes, and we talk about at-risk youth, versus we talk about youth living in at-risk communities. And without trying to understand what are the structural drivers, how education, how trauma, how mental health, how poverty drives these outcomes. And we reduce the outcomes to a single digit based on race without unpacking what race actually means within a Northern context. That's where the harm comes in. So I'm not saying don't do Black-white comparisons, but don't do it in a reductionistic way, where you end up blaming the victim. You end up blaming people because of the postal codes they live in, the zip codes they live in. As Marcus says, it's really all about resources, right? So that's the danger of doing Black-white comparisons that are decontextualized. And then those kids end up becoming demonized. And then funding doesn't go to those kids because it's like, what? They are bad kids, right? Their outcomes are deficient. So that is the importance around putting context around these problems and not just putting it into equation and spitting out results that are decontextualized, that are ahistorical. I think that's where the danger lies.
I am, everything that you're describing resonates so well with me because I come at my work with quite an interdisciplinary lens. And what you described to me really highlights the importance, just to ground this back into research for a second, the importance of being able to recognize the value of looking across disciplines and how those different disciplinary perspectives can enrich our understanding of context, and that there are a lot of important learning that we will get from working with each other. And I think some of that is how I start to think through how we, interdisciplinary work is obviously not new, but the value that's placed on it, I think, is linked to how we start to redefine excellence within academy and creating space and funding and value associated with that, I think is important, because you described it so eloquently that a lot of the comparative work is so critical, particularly in public health and in global health, but it can't exist outside of the context within which it exists. And right. We, with a foreign gaze, to use a term that Shea Amebola has written quite extensively about in the context of decolonizing global health, we, with this foreign gaze, will not be able to describe the context. That requires the local intelligence, the local expertise, and there needs to be space to be able to bring that into the research.
Right, and I know we need to wrap up, Ryan, and that's why I'll make a plug for my book here, America the Beautiful and Violent. I brought in history, I use ethnographic methods, I brought in the field of psychology, public policy, social work, right? In terms of contextualizing the story and the lives of those young people through a multidisciplinary landscape, right? And it's only then can we, as you said, Beverly, really sort of build the puzzle out, fill in the pieces by drawing from other disciplines to really unpack the richness of the lives of these communities.
Thank you so much. So rich, and a bunch more questions that I'm not going to be able to get to, unfortunately. We are about 1 minute before our scheduled wrap-up time, and I wish I could push this longer like I do most of my meetings. But to respect everyone's time, I want to just express a heartfelt thank you to yourself, Dexter, Beverly. Thank you so much to Amoya Reè, who presented and performed with a performance that sent chills down my spine, literally. So thank you to her. Thank you to Dean Brown and everyone else who was able to join us. I want to thank you to all the faculty and staff who attended, and everyone, especially our comms teams that were able to sort of help pull this together. And not just the comms teams for us, but the comms team for Case Western, Dexter, extend those gratitudes to your team. And again, just want to thank you all for joining us. I hope everyone had a fantastic and enjoyed that discussion tonight. Hopefully to see the rest of you all at our events coming up for the rest of the month. Do not miss those. They will be certainly worth your while. Again, graciously appreciating everyone's time. Have a good evening.